So yes, at this point, a couple of things. I'm handing over the chairmanship to you for the founder session, and we'll invite the founding members panel to join us on the stage. There's a few pre-prepared questions that we've kind of talked through to give this conversation some structure. But as we go through, you'll notice that there are microphones there and there. And once we get a certain part into the discussion, we invite any questions that folks have from the audience for people to please raise them through those mics or even online, and we'll hear about all the things that led to the creation of Open Targets and got it going in the first instance. So over to the founders panel.
Is this on? Yes. Okay. So I am your MC here, and I think we should kick off with introductions. Please, panel, introduce yourselves. Starting with you, Janet.
Do you want me to introduce my role in Open Targets at the same time? Okay. So I'm Janet Thornton. I think Director Emeritus or Director Emerita, depending on how good your Latin is, of Emerald EBI. And I was in charge of the Institute when we established Open Targets. And the EBI, very happily, has always had a very good relationship with our industry colleagues in Big Pharma. From the very beginning, we have had an industry club, and that ran and still runs very successfully. But it's a subscription club where members of pharma can join, and it basically provides training and a place to network. But what it didn't do was really provide a framework so that we could work deeply with our industry colleagues. That was what was missing. And we had a strategic discussions, I think, with my associate directors, Rolf is somewhere around, and Ewan, about what we ought to do about this. And we came up with the idea of running something like what became Open Targets with Big Pharma. Now, it also happened that by good fortune, I knew Patrick Vallance from UCL days, because I came to EBI from UCL. And we'd worked together on the structure of nitric oxide synthase when I was head of the sort of structural biology unit. And this was a great success. Patrick was wonderful. He was about the only clinician at that time, this is a long time ago, who really understood the power of structural biology to reveal things about a binding site, etc. And he'd been working on nitric oxide and wanted a structure of that protein. And Neil MacDonald, who was at Birkbeck, part of this biggest centre, and he worked together and generated the structure. And this was really a great success. It was a Science or Nature paper. And so I knew Patrick, and I honestly can't, all I can remember about those early days was we were sitting in a room and I was trying to describe something like what became the Open Targets platform, where we combined all the data. So I should say when I started as director, it was just after Tony Blair had become Prime Minister, and his priorities, if you remember, were education, education, education. And when I came here, I said, my priority is integration, integration, integration. But the glorious thing about Open Targets is that it was integration for a purpose. We have so much, you've seen the huge amounts of different types of data that we have. And you can't just throw it into a pot like a hot pot and mix it all up and hope that something good will come out. You have to ask questions and design something to do that. And this idea of designing something which would abstract the knowledge from all these different data types and put it into the decision about whether this might be a good target gene or a bad target gene. Of course, as a structural biologist, I can tell you, I wanted to go on to the drug design bit, but it was very clear that GSK thought of us here as the genome campus, and this was where our strength was. And so combining with the Sanger Institute and EBI, it was a wonderful opportunity to bring together the two institutes. And I think that was the other very attractive thing from my perspective, this helped to cement our interactions across the campus. So that was a bit long, but...
Hi, I'm Jeff Barrett. I was a faculty member in the Human Genetics Department at the Sanger Institute for 9 years. And when Open Targets was founded, Ewan was appointed as the interim director, and I was one of the Sanger scientific leads. And I was very excited about this opportunity because I think at that point, the kind of trajectory of the research I had been doing as an academic was really pointing in this direction, that learning about, in a systematic way, the genetics of complex diseases can start to tell us how to find good targets to intervene on, exactly the motivation Patrick was just talking about. And then are we talking about the name yet, David, or should I keep calling it Open Targets? Okay. Yeah. So when this initiative was being discussed and they were going to appoint a permanent director, I applied for that position, and I was appointed after, I think you were about a year, Ewan leading Open Targets, and then I was the director for the next 3 years before handing on to a mysterious person who shall be identified later.
So hi everyone, I'm Jessica Vamathevan. I'm the current EMBL head of strategy. When Open Targets was founded, I was at GSK in the computational biology team as the team leader. And they decided that for Open Targets, they didn't want the executive team to be made up just of academics. So that was Ewan and Ian. So they sent me in as the industry person. So I was the first operations director for Open Targets, so the first person in the South building from GSK. They basically said to me, don't let those academics take the money and run.
I'm Ian Dunham, and I was working with Ewan on various things, including ENCODE immediately before Open Targets. And then I got involved initially as the first science director, where we established the research program. And then, as Jess said, I became director in, 2019 or 18. And then immediately after that we went into COVID, so we did a lot of remote working, but then I retired in June last year. And just talking about Jessica not letting us spend all the money, I remember there's sort of interactions between GSK and the campus. There was very much this kind of initial getting to know each other phase where we were all suspicious of each other's motives. And Jessica also brought this very much operational mindset, which kept us all on the straight and narrow, which was very useful.
There, perfect. So, I'm Ewan Birney. I'm Deputy Director General of EMBL. I'm also Director Non-Emeritus of EBI after Janet. And as Jeff's mentioned, I was the interim director. My kind of memory, which I vividly remember, was talking to Malcolm Skingle over the phone. And I hadn't actually met this person. If you know Malcolm, he's quite earthy and direct. And he said, I can't use all the language he said, but he said, do not it up, Ewan. And I was stood there on a platform with this phone. I was thinking, Jesus, this is the way industry works. You know, a large amount of money, and then somebody who sounds pretty scary down the phone, telling you what not to. So, with that thought, Janet, we've heard a little bit about how it came about on this time and those moments. I think there's something here about also the relationship between you and Mike and Sanger that brought them in, and Patrick knew Mike as well, Mike Stratton. How did that work?
I can't really remember, quite honestly, because it seemed to happen once we met with Patrick. It was obvious, really, that we did it as a campus, and Mike was keen to do that, and obviously, given the focus and Jeff taking over as director, that worked very well. I think it's surprisingly difficult sometimes. We are separated by 8 feet or something on campus, and yet it can still be quite difficult to interact between different institutes. It's really quite interesting, the psychology of it. And so having this opportunity to apply for a joint pot of money and to do it collaboratively is really important for both institutions, I think. And it helped to submit. I mean, things are never perfect, don't get me wrong, and we can always improve. But I think it really was very important, and Mike was quite keen that we did this. And I think it's funded some brilliant experimental work as well. We heard that with her.
Perfect. Now, Jeff, 2 questions for you. Question 1, why did you take the job? You kind of alluded to it, and sort of, did you know what you were taking on? And the second question, talk us through the name. You changed the name. So what was the name? Why did you change it? Do you regret that decision?
So let me take the second question first. So this organization was originally called the Center for Therapeutic Target Validation, which is a very scientist choice for a name. It describes what the thing is. It's a center. What do? We validate targets. What kind of targets? Therapeutic targets. It's the Center for Therapeutic Target Validation. The problem, there are actually a number of problems. So a problem with that name is kind of like actually the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, is you don't want to say all of those words every time you have to say it. So inevitably it gets shortened. Now, EMBL has a rather beautiful shortening. And even EMBL EBI kind of rolls off the tongue. But CTTV is a deeply cursed acronym because it just doesn't sound very nice. It sounds like CCTV, like we're spying on you. It sounds a bit like CCCP, which has, Cold War affiliations. So and the thing is that it very quickly became CTTV, and you had to say it in this very fast way, and there was no way to ever use the full name. And so even before I think applied for the job, I was like, that name has to go for sure. And I think everyone agreed. I don't think it was a hard sell to say.
I think there might be one person.
And then it is Ian who actually came up with the name Open Targets, which in a stroke of genius. We paid some brand consultants, and Ian came up with the idea. So that tells you what you need to know about brand consultants. So they were actually very good, I think. But I think looking at the branding and the how it's been used around here, I think we did a pretty good job actually picking something that worked for 10 years or 9 years or whatever we changed it. And I think it worked. It was easy to say. It doesn't really, maybe except for those project codes, get ever abbreviated as OT. You could say the whole thing. And it kind of got in 2 words, I think the 2 most important things we've heard over and over again. It's still that targets. What's the problem? It's about finding the targets. You need that somewhere. But what is fundamentally different about Open Targets compared to, say, another Center for Therapeutic Target Validation is the openness. And that's the thing that I think differentiates it from similar initiatives. And I think it's great that it's kind of kept those it's kept that concept throughout the last 10 years. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I've got a lot to say about the name. But one of the things, going back to this CTTV, I think when it's kind of like when somebody shows you their baby and they tell you the name and you just go, what? So it was tried very hard not to say that. The other thing is when Googled it at that time, it turned out to be a Pakistani TV channel, which as the top hit, which was not ideal. But also Jeff said we employed these brand consultants and they didn't give us the name, which sounds like a failure, but actually they did do quite a lot because they sort of put us in the position where we were able to think of the name, which was their job essentially. So they weren't choosing it themselves, but they enabled us to do that, which I think. And then Ewan asked, did you ever regret it? And a number of times I regretted it when I was director, and they were particularly when we were talking to partners and they were asking, why is this open? Why is it open targets? Why isn't it closed targets? And that caused us some problem. But I think that's a problem about the whole thing, which is how do you simultaneously share and have some capital internally that encourages people to join you. So that was an issue with the name.
Great. I want to move to Jessica, and you mentioned, Jessica, that you came kind of as the spy, as the mole. So how did you tame the unruly academics, and broadening out from there, what were the biggest challenges in those early years of setting it all up?
Challenges. So, I mean, I think it was a great pleasure to work with you and Ian in getting set up, and I have some very strong memories of you pushing UX. So, even I think before we signed the contract, we had two UX people running through GSK with sketches and Post-its, and there was a Post-it invasion at the GSK, which everyone, so that brought a lot of, I think, energy and excitement to the place that something was happening. And then I remember getting started with cake. We had a big party to get started on the campus and bring everybody together, and signal to everybody on campus there's this new consortium and everybody can participate. I think what's fantastic, it was done at the institutional levels, right? This isn't a group to group or department to department. So everybody at GSK, it was in Stevenage, I think, was invited to this party. It's like 2,000 people, and everybody on campus. And so I think that first initial way of breaking down walls and silos, and then we got started with projects and calls and lab meetings, and I think the challenge was perhaps just finding the right connections, but making sure people who met, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work, but yeah, we're trying to make that happen basically.
And Jeff and Ian, I remember you sort of touring the world at some point to pitch to different companies. I think it's interesting. The colleague from Sanofi, I've forgotten his name, apologies, mentioned that there was this big moment of renewal, and that is a really interesting and powerful moment. But also companies have come and gone. In fact, the only constant has been GSK. So welcome and thank you to all the GSK colleagues in the room. But what was it like early on trying to persuade companies to join beyond the obvious of GSK putting it down? What do you were there some easy sells or some hard sells?
There were some easier sells, yeah. It's something that's actually, as I've been in similar interactions in other points in my career, I can sort of see those lessons as I was learning them then. It helps a lot to have a really strong internal champion, almost regardless of their level, but someone who really can articulate inside, why is this a good idea? And once you get that, then it helps to, I think, start the conversation with the more senior people, the ones who are ultimately going to make decisions, and to kind of, have that both your conversation from open targets and also the internal advocacy. There were a couple, I actually forget, I do remember now thinking about it, but there's one company that was the most annoying, who shall remain nameless, where really I learned that we went quite far in talking to this company, and I think they were pretty excited. But at some point, there's a meeting which just they go into their boss's office without us, and they have to pitch it. And they came out afterwards and told us, oh yeah, my boss wanted to talk about something else, and we never got around to it, and so we're not doing it. And it's just like very frustrating when you kind of put this investment in, and for reasons that are really nothing to do with whether it's a good or a bad idea, just kind of fall to one side. And I think we eventually did get actually quite a good, style to take these conversations, and went on a pretty good run, which has certainly continued after I left, in terms of showing the value. And as Ian was saying, it's actually not a trivial demonstration, because you have to say, this is a thing you want to invest in. It's going to help you. And we're also going to release all the data to your competitors, but please sign here.
So how you do the last bit, Ian, that magic last bit? Yeah.
I don't think we've ever quite learned that. But actually the stuff that Ellie was showing about the partner preview platform, that I think over the 10 years, we've kind of evolved to this. It's not that we didn't realize that we had to have some internal data capital. It's just how to do it. And I think now the team has got the way to do it through the partner preview platform, but also earlier on in the experimental projects where naturally, academics are actually as secretive as the industry people because they don't want to be scooped early on. So you've got to have a way that they release their data in a state that they're happy with to the partners and that they can use while not jeopardizing the publication that's going to happen in the future. So that's how we do that. On the sort of sales pitch type thing, I think with the way you make the connections with people is based on what you've done already. So the public platform, the papers that come out. But then when you get into the building and the room with the people, it's all about what's going to happen in the future. And can you sell that part to them? And can you make them believe that? And I think the other thing that we did work out relatively early on was we had to be talking to the right level of person, because otherwise we are wasting our time.
Sure.
So one thing, just say that I think the partner preview and that way of sharing the data is brilliant. And I just wanted to say a big congratulations to the team, because I think that evolved after I left, and I think really solves part of that challenge of how do you make it a benefit for everybody. And I think it doesn't really give anything up from the what do we want to do in terms of actually making it open eventually. It doesn't really slow anything down. So it's a kind of, it's a win for free. And then I just wanted to share one on that road trip we went, Takeda was one of the companies who did join for a period. They were multinational, a lot of the scientists we talked with worked in the US, for example, but they're headquartered in Japan. And so part of the process was to do a visit in Japan, and we gave talks. And, I was at that point, bubbling away in the way that I do. I was very excited about some of the IPS-derived model work that was happening in Open Targets. And I'm not really an expert in that, but I was, having to speak on behalf of it. And I remember, being told by my hosts, speak relatively slowly so the audience can follow you, and that's not super easy for me. And this very polite audience listened to me as I went blah 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 and said some things that were probably about right but not perfect about IPS. And then I realized most of the people in this audience worked in a joint Takeda organization with Shinya Yamanaka, the Nobel-winning pioneer of stem cells, and they all very politely let me say a bunch of stuff while probably thinking this guy's a doofus who doesn't know what he's talking about. They did eventually join the consortium.
So it wasn't all bad. So that people are sending some things in there, and I'd like to pick out some. I'd actually like to pick out this tricky one. Would Open Targets flourish more if it became a for-profit private company? And just, quick answers, yes or no. Would it flourish more if it was Jessica's shaking her head. Why?
So I think what's amazing to me, and I have seen other industry and academic collaborations as well, is the openness and being able to share, and the fact that it's done with academics, and it is bringing in fundamental research, which is very much lacking in industry processes and will, right? There's so much about science that we don't know. And so being able to access world-class academic institutes in this way and keeping that principles of openness and still tackling, the latest scientific questions, I think is key. And that, when it becomes a company, all of that changes to a totally different model.
Ian, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I agree. I don't think it would be the same thing, because as soon as you become a for-profit company, you've got to think about what the bottom line and how you're going to achieve that. With Open Targets as it is, I think people they're buying into the data and the projects, but they're also buying into an idea in some sense and supporting that idea. And one of the ideas is making the data available and standardized and benefiting everybody, because it's almost like a mutual benefit across many companies. And I would actually like to see a stage where we don't just have the 5 partners, but for things like the platform, we're getting money from across the sector to maintain that. So I don't think it would be the same thing, but that doesn't mean we haven't thought about it. We've thought multiple times about, could we spin the platform off as a startup, and looked at that and stared into the abyss and realized that it would be horrible, and not done it.
I do think there is this kind of fundamental business of, at one perspective, it's that kind of baseline foundational knowledge, which is kind of mainly in the public domain, but making that knowledge accessible. So there's that. But it's also a kind of de-risking, isn't it, across different company partners. In many cases, all you can do is mess up some of these decisions. So you're sort of pooling that risk. It's interesting. Now, I'd like to encourage people in the remaining, I don't know how many ever minutes. So if you want to walk to the microphone, I'll call on you. But in the meantime, I'm going to go back to this. So so I would like to pick this one up as well. What are the opportunities and challenges of having multiple industry partners? So what was it like having 5 companies around the table? So Jessica, can you start? And I'm going to go to Jeff afterwards.
I was only around when there were 2 companies.
Okay, so maybe that's did we ever have 5? Was it always 4? Yeah, 5. We've had 5. Okay, good. Do we have 5 now? So yeah. All right, sorry. Jeff.
I think the opportunities were, it was a great kind of community of like-minded people who were, when you were talking about the science, we're all legitimately excited about what we were doing, and just that bigger party was more fun to have. I think, for example, I was thinking there's still, we set these 3 therapeutic area foci of immunology and oncology and neurodegeneration quite early, and that stayed, obviously those cover a lot, but still they've managed to stay relevant and to attract lots of partners in those spaces. It did, I think, become challenging at the governance level, because the initial model, and maybe it's still exactly the model that David's coping with today, worked very well for 3 entities, I think, and then became somewhat more complicated as you added more and more entities, each of which had its own particular, agendas and priorities. And so I think balancing all of that with multiple companies did become unwieldy sometimes. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, when you have 5 partners, each of them is a different stage in their life cycle, not only within Open Targets, but perhaps in their own development as a company, and that they might be reorganizing at a particular time when you're trying to do a project call. And so nobody is interested in Open Targets at that point. They're interested in whether their lab or job is still going to be there. And when you bring new people into the consortium, you kind of made them some promises that we're going to work in this area of neurodegeneration or immunology or whatever, and you have to satisfy those as well to some extent. So you've got sort of a set of kind of constraints to balance, and then you also got to think about the people who are at the tail end of their time in Open Targets. Have you got enough for them to justify renewing and so on? So you're continually trying to balance those different demands, I think.
Now, I feel that we're actually quite EBI heavy here on this panel. So in a moment, I'm going to see if I can persuade Matt to stand up and go to the microphone back there, or come here to answer this. Because I'm kind of curious. Janet mentioned that the Open Targets gave EBI the opportunity to integrate with the purpose. But what did Sanger get from this? Just money? So Jeff, maybe you would have a stab at this, and then Matt, can I ask you for your opinion as well?
I'll give you some cover, Matt, while you think about an answer to that. Was it just the filthy lucre? No, I don't think it was just that. I think the integrate with a purpose absolutely ended up being, whether it was what Mike wanted at the beginning, I don't know, but ended up also, I think, being one of the benefits to Sanger. This point that Ian just made about, you maybe need to give a little bit of a sweetener to a new partner to say, we'll do some projects in the thing that drew you in. That brings a set of questions that are being posed by people in a company who really want to make medicines that work. And for scientists at Sanger, we don't actually necessarily get that often. Here is a disease. This is a problem that's not solved. Is there anyone on the campus who wants to work on that? And I think putting that purpose onto some of what we brought together was good. I think also, from my perspective, during the time I was here, they used Open Targets as one of the biggest successes of a Sanger EBI integration project, and really created many collaborations that I think lasted for a long time. And that was certainly upside as well.
Matt.
Yeah, no, I'd add to that. I think the opportunity to work together with EBI more closely and understand the different parts of EBI that we weren't necessarily interacting with as parts of our own kind of research, I think was really powerful. I think when we set up and worked together on HDR UK, I think it was easier doing that having done Open Targets first. I would say just internally within Sanger also, one of the stats that go show, I think it was mentioned, is how many of the projects are collaborative between different programs within Sanger. So it actually fostered kind of communication within Sanger that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise.
That's good. And Janet, do you think you mentioned integration with a purpose, but what were the benefits to EBI over that time? I can have a stab at it as well. You first.
Well, the money. That helps certainly. I think this integration with a purpose was really important, because inevitably when you're setting up data resources for one type of data, they tend to be somewhat siloed. And I think this gave a reason to bring them together more closely. And we heard from Helen about the EFO and how that was helpful across many different, the ontology across different types of data. I think the interaction with Sanger for me was very important, because we're so close together on the campus, but there is a different mentality in some ways in different parts, and so having these joint projects I think was helpful. And I think it also complemented our industry program. It meant that the members of the industry program could see the possibility of doing these bigger projects. So those for me were the advantages.
Yeah. I'd just like to add, I think for me, certainly personally, but also I think for the campus, there's a mindset thing. Companies have multi-person teams that run multi-year projects for a goal that is not a kind of PI-led goal. It is a kind of delivery of a large group of people. The success really resides with the organization. Of course, there are individuals involved in that success. And I certainly learned from exposure to companies that there was a kind of different mindset of success, a much stronger team mindset in that. I mean, we do team science here in genomics and big data, but it's different in a company. That there's really a kind of a winning team mindset. Right? Are we? I'm looking at David for time. No, well, I've got plenty. Okay, so that's wonderful. So let's go back here. I'm looking at my notes down here. So what advice do you have for the current team? So if you could give some small, pithy advice to the current team, what would you advise them? Let's start with Ian.
I'm hoping something will occur to me now.
Should have primed you.
Well, I actually think that Ellie said this in her talk, which is you've always got to focus on the question, which is how do you modulate that target to treat disease? And I think probably after 9 years of saying that every time we had a project call, it still remains true. That's the key. Everything has to fit in with that. So you don't start from the bottom up saying, we've got this, how do we use it? You start at the other end and saying, how do we fit that paradigm of modulating targets to treat disease?
I think similar to Ian is, is to stay focused on the goal. And it's amazing to me to see open targets grow to this level while still maintaining the founding principles, of openness and equality. Equal partnership was actually a very important principle. I think everything that we did and set up, even in the early days, some of which are fantastic, that are still continuing, like integration days, and was all focused around, does it accomplish that overall goal and maintain the principles? So I think my advice would be just keep doing what you're doing. It's wonderful.
I think I would suggest now might be a good time to go back. I'm going to look right at David as I give this advice. Go back to the beginning founding principle and ask the organization has been a huge success. Did it do that thing that was written down at the very beginning? I'm not sure it did, because it's an extremely hard problem. But, I think Patrick, when he started thinking about this, when he came to talk to Janet, he had this idea that maybe now the genomic data is at this turning point where we're going to really blow this wide open, and we're going to know exactly which targets to go after for all kinds of diseases. And I think it was really nice that David started with the example of CFTR, which is, I think, the thing we would love to have, how beautifully, that was elucidated about the different kinds of mutations, exactly what you had to do with the drug, that you had a cellular assay that could show, does your drug do it or not? And you knew that cellular assay would predict with good accuracy will it work in patients. And that is still not very often, I don't think, happening, because it's extremely hard. And that's, is there a way, and that, I think, David, you had that slide, which I think was your formulation, Ewan, of what's the point? It's for, all the targets X, can we understand is perturbing it? Was Ian, sorry.
All good ideas.
For all interesting Y. It sounded like a turning them, but that is a kind of nice, succinct thing, and it's a hard thing to actually do in practice. And is there a way now where I think there's been tons of progress in all of the different ways at which you can answer that question to really, have that laser-like focus? I think it was always the case that the world and science and interesting things pull you into doing lots of stuff. And it's like, if open targets can really, in the next 10 years, crack it wide open, the way Patrick, I think, was thinking of, it has to have that focus on exactly that question of how do you actually figure the one, and what do you do to that target to make it work?
Good. Janet, do you have advice?
I really like the comment from the Sanofi guy that engagement comes from their end and our end, and having that a close understanding about what you're trying to do and how you achieve it, I think is fundamental for the success of any of your individual projects. So I would encourage this coming together, because at the end of the day, it's usually two PIs or, a team and a PI here trying to deliver what they've said they're going to do. And that requires understanding on both sides. And that's not always easy. It takes time to develop. So I think that sort of like forming relationships, you have to give it time, but you also need to encourage it. And I think that's really important in anything going forward.
I'm going to add my little piece of advice. I've often felt that genetics and genomics was like a massive power tool. That old analogy, which is, if you have a really good hammer, make all your problems nails. And genetics, whenever you could change a problem into a genetics problem, we had an incredible hammer to like drive through insight. I think we've got a new massive weapon in our arsenal, and that's AI. It's a thing, if you hadn't noticed. And I think that's another massive way to really, go back and look at some old questions that looked like they were impenetrable, looked like they were solid rock, and now we have a new way to drive a kind of huge wedge into a problem, crack open some problems. Quite whether we'll solve everything, I doubt it. But I think there is a kind of new thing to hammer away with.
Yeah, I was saying during the lunch that I think if some head of R&D at a major pharma came out tomorrow and said, I'm going to do a similar thing, AI would probably be the cornerstone they would put it rather than genetics or genomics. And so maybe that there is an opportunity though that open targets, I think AI, there's hype, but there's also real stuff, like real problems it will solve in the next 10 years. And having some element of that here, because the data is essential to making that work, could be extremely powerful.
And just on that AI theme, I think, definitely AlphaFold and friends, one really big problem has been solved with AI. And I think there are multiple big problems that will fall via it. And this is why Jessica, to put on our EMBL hats, because Jessica, as part of EMBL strategy, have been running the EMBL AI strategy. And we're so excited. We're like little kids with a new set of tools getting at that. So that's the future. Part of the future. Right. No more questions there. I've got the thumbs up from David. So with that, thank you very much, panel. And I hand you back to David, I suspect.